Welcome to the Vaguely Interesting podcast. Each week I pick my favourite post and the most memorable anniversaries to feature as the podcast selection. Before this week's podcast, just a reminder that you can subscribe to the weekly update email at vaguelyinteresting.co.uk/subscribe or look at the other podcasts at vaguelyinteresting.co.uk/podcasts. This week's podcast selection is the United States of Greater Austria. As the world tumbled into the chasm of conflict in the early years of the 20th century, one European country carried a light for tolerance, federalism, peace and prosperity. The United States of Greater Austria had been forged from an amalgam of nationalities, linguistic and ethnic groups. Nationalistic conflict, partisan politics, ethnic tensions and division were replaced with cooperation and federalism. The Empire of Austria had become an empire of the people, with opportunity for all under the uniting, benevolent and seemingly timeless rule of Habsburg Emperor Franz Ferdinand. Could it have happened? Did Gavrilo Princip's bullet not only plunge Europe into war, but also kill an idea that could have tamed nationalism? At the beginning of the First World War, almost all of the principal participants were monarchies. By the end of the conflict, only the United Kingdom, Belgium, Serbia, Romania, Japan and Italy would emerge with their rulers unchanged. And even there, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha would be renamed the House of Windsor in the UK and Van Belgie or de Belgique in bilingual Belgium. In the Central Powers, Bulgaria's monarchy also survived, but only at the price of the abdication of the reigning Tsar Ferdinand in favour of his son, who became Tsar Boris III. The King of Serbia went one better than surviving, heading the enlarged Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in 1918, a state that was widely known in the rest of the world as the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and actually took this title officially in 1929. Great empires, historic kingdoms and ancient crowns came crashing down in the maelstrom of post-war political unrest. The four doomed emperors ruled almost 330 million people, whilst their vast empires covered almost 20% of the world's landmass. The Hohenzollerns were unceremoniously booted out of a newly republican Germany, whilst in Russia the Romanovs suffered a more immediate and violent end at the hands of their revolutionary jailers. The Ottoman Empire would lose the bulk of its territory in the southern Levant and Arabian Peninsula, and, in the remaining territory, was unceremoniously dumped and replaced by the Republic of Turkey. The sick man of Europe continued to defy expectations to live on until the abolition of the Sultanate in 1922 and the Caliphate in 1924. Perhaps the most spectacular collapse was the disintegration of the Dual Monarchy of Austria-Hungary, the creation of 6 successor states, and the deposing of the House of Habsburg. From the 15th century onwards, the Habsburgs had played a pivotal role in European and world history. If Queen Victoria was the grandmother of Europe, the Habsburgs had, by the end of the 19th century, become a curious and increasingly eccentric great-uncle, a relic of a bygone age. But at their peak, they had held sway over Spain and Portugal, and controlled both of these Iberian powers' old and New World colonial empires. In the rest of Europe, they ruled the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, occupied the throne of the Holy Roman Emperors, and, at various times, directly governed Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, most of modern-day Italy, and sizable chunks of France. For a few years in the mid-16th century, it even seemed likely that England would be subsumed into the imperial orbit after the marriage of Philip II of Spain to Mary Tudor. But by the outbreak of the First World War, Habsburg power had concentrated in Central and Southern Europe in the form of the Dual Monarchy of Austria-Hungary. It was slightly larger in area than Germany to the north, but had slightly fewer people, about 50.6 million compared to Germany's 67 million. More importantly for its performance in the war, and for the basis of what is a fascinating counterfactual history, it was a truly multi-ethnic empire. The key components were Austria and Hungary, lending both their names and their royal titles to the country. One of the only binding forces in the country was the monarchy, K und K or K and K, for Kaiserlich und Königlich, imperial and royal, the Austro-Hungarian equivalent of HM for Her Majesty. Franz Joseph, as Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, ruled over, unsurprisingly enough, Austrians and Hungarians, but also other German-speaking minorities, Bohemians, or Slovaks, Italians, Slovenians, Croats, Bosnians, Serbians, Romanians, Ukrainians, and Poles. Across the whole country, German and Hungarian were the two most spoken first languages, accounting for 24% and 20% respectively in 1920. But of course this meant that a majority of people in the country did not speak either of these two languages as their mother tongue. Barely functional in peacetime, this polyglot agglomeration came unstuck under the ferocious nationalistic pressures of the First World War. One of the most popular points of divergence for counterfactual history is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. What if the assassins had bungled the shooting as they had their early attempts to bomb the royal motorcade? What if the driver hadn't taken a wrong turn? What if the Archduke had heeded warnings not to visit Bosnia on such a symbolically laden day? One of the most fascinating alternative histories arises not only from the survival of Franz Ferdinand, but is intimately linked to his vision of the future. Instead of the ruin of nationalistic war, could the dual monarchy have turned itself into the model for multicultural unity? Was this idea a precursor for the European Union? Could it have been the European equivalent of the United States of America? Out of its many languages, ethnicities and territories, could a single country and identity have been forged? This was the idea behind the United States of Greater Austria, or the Vereinigte Staaten von Großösterreich. In place of the German and Hungarian-dominated dual monarchy, the state would be federalised, drawing the poison of ethnic tension, linguistic divide and nationalism. There was certainly plenty of poison to draw. One of the main authors of the plan, Gavrilo Princip, noted that Austro-Hungarian politics of the early 20th century was marked by endless parliamentary crisis, bitter fights, and a savage kind of hatred, all the nationalities being bitter and throwing the responsibility on the Viennese circles. The messy historical compromises and relics of territorial divisions dating back to the Holy Roman Empire would be swept away. In their place, rational political units based on ethnic groups would ensure representation for all within a united federal structure. The Habsburg monarchy would become a Völkerreich, an empire of the peoples. Italians in Trentino, Czechs in Bohemia, Croatians in Croatia, and of course, states for the German and Hungarian speakers. The plan even sought to deal with problematic linguistic enclaves and multicultural metropolises by creating autonomous regions and city governments. Of course, the utopian plan didn't happen. There's no way of knowing whether it ever could have happened. The plan looks neat on paper and drawn out in maps, but nationalistic tensions were not always so easily overcome. Popovici summed up the promise of the project and why, in reality, it never got off the ground. The great origin, language, customs and mentality, diversity of different nationalities requires for the whole empire of the Habsburgs a certain state form, which can guarantee that not a single nationality will be threatened, obstructed or offended in its national political life, in its private development, in its national pride, in one word, in its way of feeling and living. In this week in 1922, the BBC is launched to the general public, making its first radio broadcast from the 2LO London Broadcasting Station at Marconi House on the Strand. In 1984, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, announces that the pound note would be phased out by the end of the year, replaced by the coins that had entered circulation in April. In 1674, the Dutch formally handed over the New Netherlands to the English. It would achieve huge success in its new name of New York. And finally, in 393 CE, Flavius Theodosius Augustus, today known as the Emperor Theodosius, declared that Christianity would become the official state religion of the Roman Empire. And that's all from this week's edition. Thanks for listening to this vaguely interesting podcast. And don't forget you can get far more vaguely interesting articles and updates from vaguelyinteresting.co.uk, and you can sign up for a weekly update from vaguelyinteresting.co.uk/subscribe. Until next time, I hope you have more than a vaguely interesting week.